Good morning and good evening, everyone who are joining us from the United States, and welcome to this third webinar in the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network's Asia Dialogue on China-US Relations. My name is Joel Petersson Ivre. I'm a policy fellow at APLN and I'm based in Seoul, where it's currently the morning of February 20th, Asia time, and the evening of February 19th for our audience in the United States. This is an open and live recorded webinar, which will be available later on the APLN website. Just briefly about APLN, we are an independent, not-for-profit organization and a network of over 160 former serving and emerging political, military, diplomatic, and academic leaders from 22 countries across the Asia-Pacific. We're registered and headquartered here in Seoul, where I am right now, but we address regional defense and security challenges with a particular focus on reducing nuclear weapons risk. But today's webinar, we are talking more specifically about the second Trump administration, which is currently starting on its second month. And we are starting to see some signs of a Taiwan policy emerge from Washington. We have an excellent panel of speakers here today, and they will help us try to understand how Trump is seen from Taiwan, what this return means for the status quo, and how to make sense of the Trump administration's emerging Taiwan policy. So I don't want to preempt the discussion too much, but I will note that in the last week we have seen the US State Department drop language that opposes Taiwanese independence from its website, with some predictable responses from Beijing that are quite negative. And there's also some stronger language coming out of, for example, the US, Japan, Korea trilateral, where they say that they oppose coercive changes to the status quo, and that's a new formulation. So as we all know, in the business of interpreting US, China, and Taiwan relations in general, language is quite important. So our main presenter today is Christy Xu, who is the director of the Taiwan-ASEAN Studies Center at the Chung-Hua Institution for Economic Research. And we're delighted to co-host this webinar together with the CIER today. Christy wrote a report for APLN last October, which is titled In Defense of the Status Quo, and she will share her analysis with us today. After that, we will hear from our panel of respondents, who will provide some updates and additional perspectives, as this report was written before the US election. And when we were planning this webinar, I and Christy were a bit worried that the timing would be a bit off when we would get to February, but it seems like we have matched the news cycle perfectly. We're also going to hear from Dr. Anne Hsiao, who's a researcher at the Institute for International Relations in Taipei, who will elaborate a bit more on the status quo. Then Dr. Ian Chong, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. But today he's joining us from the same room as Christy. That's why his microphone is off, but his video is on. He will speak a little bit about ASEAN. Finally, Dr. Frank O'Donnell, my colleague here at APLN, who's our APLN Senior Research Advisor, is joining us from Boston, and he'll help us give an East Coast read of the Trump administration's emerging Taiwan policy. So once we have everyone have said their part, we will open up the floor for discussion and questions. There's a Q&A box where we highly encourage you to submit any questions. Ideally, keep the questions short, relevant to today's topic, and if you want to be extra helpful to me, please direct your questions to a specific speaker. And then finally, on behalf of APLN, I would just like to thank our funder, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, whose generous support has enabled this webinar. And with that, Christy, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. I want to thank first the APLN for publishing the report and hosting the webinar. The report was published in October last year. A month later, the US held the presidential elections. The new administration took office last month. So it seems now is the perfect time to host a webinar to discuss the status quo across the Taiwan Strait issues and updates on new development. So firstly, I will quickly brief the major points in the report. In January last year, Taiwan held presidential and parliamentary election. Mr. Lai Ching-te, the candidate representing the ruling Democratic Progressive Party and the former vice president, was elected president, winning DPP's third consecutive presidential election following President Tsai Ing-wen's two terms from 2016 to 2024, but DPP lost the majority in the Legislative Yuan. Before running the campaign, Lai had claimed himself to be a pragmatic worker for independence and advocated for Taiwanese independence, and thus he was closely watched by China. The United States and some other countries, including Japan and Singapore and ASEAN countries, were also concerned that Lai's stance towards China would escalate tensions in the Strait. And Lai responded carefully to these concerns before and after the elections. Regardless, China has increased military, economic, political, and diplomatic pressures and coercion on Taiwan. For example, economically, China has unilaterally terminated the zero tariffs applied on imports from Taiwan under the Cross-Strait Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, the ECFA. And this is the first time that China took actions to revoke tariff concessions to Taiwan under the most important institutional arrangement between the two sides. On military front, China has increased the scale and the frequency of military exercise across the Strait and around Taiwan. In the meantime, surveys conducted by Taiwan's National Zhengzhi University on Taiwanese people's attitudes toward relations with China show strong support for the option, maintaining status indefinitely or permanently. In 2023, the annual survey finds the highest support for maintaining status quo indefinitely since 1994, which is 33.6%. It further rises to 34.1% in the 2024 survey. The survey also finds lowest support for maintaining status quo, moving towards independence since 2020. This finding together reflects more than 60% in Taiwan, neither supporting independence nor unification, showing Taiwan society's rejection of independence. This changing attitude of Taiwan society towards China reveals maintaining peace in the Strait is prioritizing Taiwan, despite increasing unfavorable views of China. The report argues that President Lai, though a believer in Taiwan independence, will not declare independence, as he fully understands such a move will immediately trigger China's military action. The general sentiment in Taiwan will not support such a decision either. The majority of the KNT and TPP in the Legislative Yuan or the blue camp and white camp will play a balancing role in ensuring Lai will not cross this red line. In this regard, Taiwan will very likely maintain status quo in the next 4 years under Lai. The Taiwan issue lies in the core of U.S.-China relation, though the U.S. government's position is to ensure no unilateral attempts to force or change status quo from either side of the Strait. How U.S. handles the Taiwan issue always directly affects U.S.-China relation. And when U.S.-China relations were smooth, cross-strait relations usually move in a positive direction. Conversely, when U.S.-China relations become less stable, cross-strait relations also became difficult. As long as China believes the U.S. is supporting Taiwan's independence or pushing Taiwan further away from reunification, it will inevitably stand ready to react strongly. Its strong reaction to then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit in Taiwan in August 2022 is clear evidence. The U.S. remains a key player in maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait. These are the key messages in the report. Now, I would like to give some update in the strategic situation in the past 3 months. The most important development is, of course, the U.S. election and that Mr. Trump returns to the White House in January. So now the questions are whether Trump, under his second term, will remain the same stance on Taiwan, on China, on status quo. How would he respond if China unilaterally change the status quo? The answers will have huge impacts in the strategic situation in the Taiwan Strait. It is noteworthy that, as Joe also mentioned, that just last week, the U.S. State Department revised the language of the Taiwan-U.S. relation on its website. In the new language, the phrase "we do not support Taiwan independence" was removed, while new wording is added. We expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means, free from coercion, in a manner acceptable to the people on both sides of the strait. Here, the phrases "free from coercion" and "acceptable to the people on both sides of the strait" are added for the first time. Though the State Department claims it is a routine update and that Trump's One China policy remains the same, the change of wording sparks rebuff from Beijing, accusing Trump administration of serious regression in its position on Taiwan. So it remains to be observed how Trump will roll out his policy on the cross-strait issues and how it will respond to China's aggression. As for Taiwan, Trump has already for many times accused Taiwan of stealing cheap industry and jobs from the U.S. and demands that Taiwan should pay a high protection fee. These remarks are creating increasing anxiety in Taiwan. Furthermore, the peace negotiation of Russia-Ukraine war between the U.S. and Russia further ignites the Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow scenario debates here in Taiwan. Does Trump will still consider Taiwan a partner with shared value? Like government and people in Taiwan are craving for answers. I have less than around 1 minute. So lastly, I would like to emphasize the importance of all related parties remaining self-restrained and re-engaging in constructive dialogues. Last but not least, here are some policy recommendations. Resume cross-strait dialogues to avoid escalation tension in the strait. Whether the Chinese tourists will be allowed to come to Taiwan will be an indicator to see whether the cross-strait relation is getting in a more positive direction. Second, ensure correct understanding of Taiwanese support for the status quo and very low interest in seeking independence. Third, explore an innovative theory to replace the 1992 consensus. And fourth, the U.S. and other countries should also increase joint efforts to deter Chinese use of force or coercion and assist Taiwan's meaningful international participation. So with this, I would like to stop here and welcome comments and questions later. Thank you very much, and over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Christy. So then with that, I'm going to just turn over to Dr. Hsiao, just to note that a central concept of this report is obviously the idea of maintaining the status quo and how each actor can work towards that goal. So I would be interested to hear from Dr. Hsiao a little bit about how the status quo is defined between the three parties in Taiwan, China, and the US, and how we can perhaps move to a shared understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and hello to everyone. First, I would also like to thank the APLN and CIER, Christy, for inviting me to participate in this very important and timely discussion. I have the pleasure of reading Christy's report published in October 2024 and generally agree with her policy recommendations. Since the report's publication, a lot has happened. And the report brings us back to think again, what is the status quo in the Taiwan Strait? And what is the status quo that is to be defended? These questions are actually more complicated than they appear, and I hope my general comments can provide some additional context to our further discussions. Status quo literally means the existing state of affairs. And nowadays, many people will instinctively think status quo in the Taiwan Strait means no war. At the same time, pundits have suggested that status quo across the Taiwan Strait is not static. So we have to think about what peace and stability really means. This is true from 1949 to 1979 up until now. Situations across the Taiwan Strait have evolved from active armed hostilities to frozen conflict, then to political stalemate that has lasted for nearly 5 decades. To my understanding, what connotes status quo for each of the 3 key parties involved, Taiwan, China, the PRC, and the United States, actually differ. For time's sake, I think instead of going into too much detail, I would identify 3 key elements in the mainstream Taiwanese perspective as a starting point for general comparison and to try to pick up some relevant points from Christie's report. The first of the central elements in Taiwanese status quo is to preserve the sovereignty of the Republic of China, which was established in 1912 and continues to exist after 1949 on the island of Taiwan and other offshore areas under its jurisdiction, as well as to maintain self-government of the population under a free and democratic political system. The second key element is the desire to resolve the cross-strait question peacefully, as Christie has mentioned. Since democratization in the early 1990s, the successive governments in Taiwan have been consistently calling upon Beijing to accept the reality of equal political coexistence and to renounce use of force as a means of resolving their differences. Although different governments' policy expressions and approaches may have varied from time to time. Under current President Lai Ching-te, his remark made in the ROC's National Day address on 10th of October last year that the Republic of China and People's Republic of China are not subordinate to each other draws particular controversy. Although it was actually his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, who first made this remark on a National Day address back in 2021, Lai's track record as a self-proclaimed pragmatic Taiwan independence worker gave PRC more excuse to crash Taiwan independence activism from the start of his presidency. So now I turn to the PRC. For the PRC, status quo embodies the one China principle, namely, there is only one China in the world and Taiwan is an integral part of the Chinese territory. The ROC was replaced by the PRC after 1949 as the sole legal government of China. Taiwan is an unresolved problem of the Chinese Civil War, which must eventually be resolved through reunification. For a long time, maintaining status quo has been to accept, even though reluctantly, the political stalemate across the Taiwan Strait. However, for President Xi Jinping, prolonged division has become increasingly untenable. To achieve his historic mission of the Chinese national rejuvenation and a world great power status in the new era, Taiwan must be united with the PRC, and this is made clear at the address to commemorate 40 years of the issuance of the letter to the Taiwan compatriots in 2019. Under Xi, status quo cannot be maintained any longer. Beijing is determined to use all means necessary, including coercion or force if required, to punish and remove any obstructions, namely Taiwan independence and foreign interference, so as to bring about reunification for the Chinese nation. And it is worth noting here that PRC's interpretation of Taiwan independence includes everything that is inconsistent with its one China principle. Having said that, his aspiration and approach is not in concert with the general will of the Taiwanese population. From this, I will turn to my third key element in the Taiwan status quo perception. That is, as a democracy, the will of the population carries considerable weight to Taiwan's rendering of cross-strait relations. Christie's report was right to find that by late 2024, polls conducted by the Election Center of National Zhenji University in Taipei suggested the subject's preference toward maintaining status quo indefinitely has reached its highest since the survey began in 1994. I will also add that if historic low ratio of both unification immediately and maintaining status quo then unification are also taken into account, the expectational gap between Xi Jinping and the Taiwanese people as a whole seems to have grown wider. As to the controversial statement mentioned earlier that the PRC and ROC are not subordinate to each other, in another survey conducted a few days after President Lai's National Day address, nearly 70% of the interviewees agreed with Lai. Nearly 80% disagreed with PRC's military exercises around, including joint sword exercises around Taiwan. Some 74% do not identify themselves with unification in accordance with the PRC's One China principle, nor the 1992 consensus as interpreted by Beijing. Moreover, nearly 90% support the government to uphold that the future of Taiwan and cross-strait relations must be decided by the 2.3 million people of Taiwan. So finally, I turn briefly towards to the United States' role and position. For decades, U.S. main role has been to maintain a delicate balance in the political stalemate between Beijing and Taipei and to avoid war across the Taiwan Strait. U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity has generally served its purpose. However, the sustainability of the strategic ambiguity has come under increasing challenge because the PRC has risen to challenge U.S. power supremacy and global leadership, while Taiwan faces increasing existential threat from the PRC that has bluntly attempted to change the status quo equilibrium to its favor. From a theoretical angle, there is clearly a power transition in the Taiwan Strait, and status quo has also become more volatile. So should U.S. turn to strategic clarity instead? I think there are actually many questions to ask for this question. But on the one hand, the long-standing strategic ambiguity policy framework seems still be able to provide the flexibility needed for U.S. to deal with the Taiwan question. But on the other hand, it will be desirable if at the operational level, Trump and his second administration can clearly uphold its commitment to help Taiwan defend itself against Beijing's unilateral attempts to change or erode Taiwan's continuous self-governing political existence. To ensure this, Taiwan actually have a lot of work cut out for it, and I'll be happy to discuss this more with the audience. So thank you. And turning back to you, Joe.
Right. Thank you so much, Anne. I think is an excellent summary of how the different parties around the Taiwan Strait view the status quo. We thought we would actually go ahead and kind of nuance this a little bit more and see how this is also perceived throughout the region. And specifically, we have invited Professor Ian Chong to speak a little bit about ASEAN as a stakeholder in the Taiwan Strait. This is a point that is brought up in Christie's report as well, where she, for example, points out the large number of Southeast Asian nationals who are present in Taiwan and live and work there. So with that, I'm interested to hear from Professor Chung how the ASEAN can be a productive stakeholder in the Taiwan issue. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much, Joel. Thank you to APLN and CEIR for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here this morning. So I guess I'm going to sort of go back a little bit to the status quo and the supposed strategic ambiguity just for a moment, because I think it's helpful to sort of understand how these sorts of concepts might be read outside of the Taiwan PRC US triangle. So in essence, and this is relevant to ASEAN, and you'll see why in a little bit. So in essence, the status quo as understood not in a legal sense, but in a behavioral manner, is one where Taiwan, for all intents and purposes, does its own thing, right? Is able to sort of make its own decisions and have a, basically be fully autonomous. The regime type on Taiwan is not particularly relevant to its ability to act autonomously. And what will sort of change is if it comes under the control of the PRC, right? And you have a sort of final arbiter decision maker above the government in Taipei, right? So a change in the status quo is one where PRC establishes control. And also, I would say that what we are at now is at an impasse, in the sense that the PRC has told us clearly that they want to exert control over Taiwan. And Taiwan, from Christie's report, and also if you look at opinion polls, basically that opposition is highly unappealing. I mean, if you throw in the people who talk about maintaining status quo now and move towards unification, there you have basically about 90% of people in Taiwan say that they want the status quo in some way, shape, or form. And I don't think any politician is going to go against that sort of overwhelming opinion, including Mr. Leisinger. And I think what the PRC is doing essentially is trying to erode that sort of situation to put itself at a more advantageous position. That includes, of course, painting everyone who doesn't hold its view as provocative, etc., as trying to seize the moral high ground. Now, in terms of strategic ambiguity, I mean, this specific term, this specific formulation came out of the Clinton administration in the mid-90s formulated specifically by Joseph Nye, but there's an older concept behind it, which is dual deterrence, that goes all the way back to the 1950s, where the Eisenhower administration wanted to deter the PRC from attacking Taiwan, and also wanted to deter Taiwan from provoking the PRC. In that instance, it had to do with Chiang Kai-shek trying to retake the mainland. Later, that evolved to trying to prevent Taiwan from going too far in pressing its separateness and distinctiveness from the PRC in ways that would be provocative. Strategic ambiguity essentially I feel is a clumsy way of trying to put all that together. Now, how is all this relevant to states in Southeast Asia? The status quo is one where many Southeast Asian states have benefited significantly. Taiwan is a major trading partner, so it regularly ranks within the top 10 for trading partners. For Singapore specifically, I think it's the 5th largest trading partner. Investment-wise, it's also pretty big, and it's especially prominent in places like Thailand and Vietnam and Malaysia. So having a Taipei authority that Southeast Asian states can deal with, that is beneficial. And at the same time, they also want to be able to have this sort of separate and mutually beneficial relationship with Beijing. Beijing, the PRC is the largest trading partner with Southeast Asia, and I think it is, despite all the Belt and Road and all, I think it's the 4th or 5th largest investor. So they want to basically have their cake and eat it too. And how all this comes together is essentially, I think many capitals in Southeast Asia, there are exceptions, they, in essence, don't want to think about changes to the status quo. They don't want to think about the differences between Taipei and Beijing. They wish to be able to essentially continue to free ride on the United States, Taipei and Beijing managing the relationship in ways that they can benefit from. They will very occasionally, when they see a potential sort of unsettling of the situation, talk about a hope for the status quo to continue or for a peaceful resolution of differences across the Taiwan Strait. However, by and large, there is a lack of interest and desire to delve more deeply into cross-strait issues because of a belief that it doesn't concern them and perhaps there's little that they can do. But this belies the fact that if you see instability across the Taiwan Strait or a situation where the status quo goes away, Southeast Asia will be potentially highly affected, right? So apart from the trade stuff that I talked about, you also have to consider how trade happens, not just the fact that trade exists, right? So if you think about shipping lanes, if you think about submarine cables, in the event that there is some sort of escalation in tensions, everything from a blockade up, you would see significant disruption. You could see submarine cables, being severed by one side or the other. This would mean financial flows of technology, even sort of regular commerce, right, being severely affected. But no actor, I think, in Southeast Asia wants to really think about these sorts of things. And so they just try to ignore the issue. Sometimes under pressure from Beijing, they will give in on some of the wording because they believe it doesn't matter to them. So in last year, for instance, we saw Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim from Malaysia. He took away an element of Malaysia's One China policy, which was the expectation that any resolution across Taiwan Strait would be peaceful. President Prabowo Subianto from Indonesia did very much the same thing, because for them, this wording, it really doesn't matter, and they will just cede sort of initiative on dealing with cross-strait issues to other actors, even though they have a direct stake. So then we get to the sort of issues of when you see some sort of crisis arise. We have, by some estimates, about 1 million, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, people from different Southeast Asian states working and living in Taiwan. So this includes the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand to some degree, and those would be the largest ones. There's talk about evacuation, right? Should there be some sort of crisis? But while in principle there is a intent, none of this, with the exception of the Philippines, because of proximity, have really come into sort of any concrete discussion. Moreover, if you're talking about non-combatant evacuation, that has already sort of ceded ground, and to accept that you can't do anything about conflict prevention, because there's that sort of free-riding attitude that I mentioned earlier. The Philippines is a little bit different in the fact that it is very close to Taiwan physically, so any sort of disruption, instability will spill over very, very quickly. And so I think they're the only party in Southeast Asia that have thought more actively about these sorts of issues. And that's also in part because they have ongoing, very heated disputes with the PRC on the South China Sea and work quite closely with the US. So under the Trump administration, and this is my last point, all of this, of course, potentially might become unsettled, but in essence, no actor, with the partial exception of the Philippines in Southeast Asia, really wants to think about the issue and do anything to really address it. Part of it is, if you talk about these things, it could raise Beijing's ire, and you want to avoid that. So essentially, we have a see no evil, hear no evil, say no evil approach across Southeast Asia. Let me end there. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Ian. Yeah, I think it's very interesting to kind of hear those perspectives from Southeast Asia, even even though there seems to be a quite passive approach. I think might consider that even if the Philippines has some kind of maybe a bit bigger stake than the others, the US defense minister, famously forgot that Philippines was even a US ally in his confirmation remarks. So I do think we have to consider how much they are actually able to do on their own, if anything at all. And so on that note, I'm a bit or clumsy transition. Maybe I'm going to head over to Frank, who is joining us from Boston and who will provide us a little bit of a US read on and prediction on the US policy going forward based on what we can see having happened so far and various statements coming out of Washington. So Frank, over to you.
Thanks, Hsiao, and really pleased to be part of this panel and part of just discussing Christie's excellent report. So from one U.S. perspective, from what I've observed, U.S. policy toward Taiwan is still in flux. Moves like the change to the State Department language on Taiwan, which Christie and Anne referred to earlier, are not without significance, although it remains to be seen if this language is converted into a meaningful U.S. policy difference on Taiwan, a policy difference from those of the Biden administration or even the first Trump administration. I actually think that the Trump administration is still working out what its Taiwan policy is going to be, as well as its broader Indo-Pacific approach. And in his first month, the Trump administration has mainly focused on cutbacks and restructuring of the U.S. federal bureaucracy, and latterly on Russia-Ukraine and the U.S. relationship with Europe, as we've recently seen. I think the recent decision to keep the director or de facto ambassador Raymond Green in post at the American Institute of Taiwan, who's been in that post since July 2024, is a rare example of the Trump administration seeing the benefit of continuity in that role. Whereas in many other circumstances, they have preferred to terminate the senior official, even if there's not a replacement lined up. However, I also think that continuity is another indicator that the Trump administration has not yet determined its Taiwan policy. And when it does, I would expect someone more ideologically aligned with Trump thinking, with the Trump movement to take Green's place to start enacting that policy. And so if the policy is still being formulated, if it still has not become clear, there are certain advantages. This is a rare moment for Taiwan to take advantage of this opportunity, and especially to try to engage the administration at this point where it's most likely to be able to be influenced. We have seen signs of this outreach from the Taiwanese administration, including the recent announcement of a planned $8 to $10 billion U.S. arms purchase, likely including HIMARS systems and coastal defense cruise missiles. The recent visit of Taiwanese officials to D.C. to talk about buying more U.S. liquefied natural gas, LNG, but explicitly in terms of it being a measure to reduce the Taiwan trade surplus with the U.S., a commitment to spending 3% of Taiwan's GDP in defense, and a commitment to invest more in the U.S. economy. So I think that, Taiwan recognizes this and is starting this process. However, these do need to be ideally paired with as much direct engagement with Trump himself as can be achieved. Firstly, to absolutely ensure that he's aware of these important moves. Secondly, because this administration and its policies will much more closely reflect the views of Trump than his first administration, as you can see from his senior personnel choices. And thirdly, to ensure the messaging of Taiwan's significance to the U.S. is in terms and language that resonates with Trump himself. So for example, making the points that Taiwan's huge economy and all this trade and investments with the U.S. Would vanish if China successfully invaded Taiwan. That Taiwan is a democracy that wants to continue investing into the U.S., unlike China. That a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would wreck the global economy and stock markets. And also that Taiwan is not the disruptor here, which, the public opinion findings in strong favor of the status quo, which Christie referred to in her report, could usefully bolster. One other point just on the US context to address here is that there is a lot of commentary, mostly within the US, but also I see being carried abroad about how there is going to be a coming internal policy fight in the Trump administration once more DoD civilian officials get into post, with some being quote unquote China prioritizers who might shift the Trump administration toward a much more hawkish posture against China, and that Taiwan might benefit from this. I think this expectation is overblown. Trump has built this administration to reflect his own views. And even more than other presidents, there will be no substitute for trying to engage with him as directly as possible. At the same time, I also fully agree with Christie's recommendation that Taiwan broaden its relationships with other potential states, such as South Korea, Singapore, which could serve as interlocutors between Taipei and Beijing, and that Taiwan overall deepen its relationships with ASEAN and other regional states. To pick one, again, partly from the news today, Australia, for example, has been increasingly concerned with Taiwan's future in recent years. And the recent appearance of Chinese warships 150 nautical miles off Sydney is another factor that can bring Taiwan and Australia closer together. And so diversifying and deepening its other strategic relationships while it tries to engage the U.S. administration at this moment when it's deciding what its policy is going to be, are definitely kind of the recommendations that I would make in this context in the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And with that, I am going to turn over back to Christy to respond to some of the points that were made. Just before that, I just would like to encourage our audience to make use of the Q&A box and to submit questions through that. And ideally, do it in a brief manner and address to a specific participant of the panel. And just as a reminder, we are scheduled for another half hour of open discussion, which will kick off with Christy responding to the points made by the panelists. So Christy, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for Anne's and also Ian and also Frank's comments. They are very valuable and also very helpful, and especially for Anne and Ian's historical review of the status quo and strategic ambiguity or this kind of concept involving in the past decades. The report, when I discussed with Joe about writing the report, it was right after the election and right after the election of Taiwan and after the inauguration of President Lai Ching-te on May 20th. So at that time, we discussed about, as I mentioned in the report and earlier, that there are people here and also people in China and also in other countries worry about Lai Ching-te's past record in talking about this independence, and therefore we need to discuss when Lai Ching-te is now the president of Taiwan, and what could be the development across the strait, as well as Taiwan-U.S. relation, which will inevitably affect Taiwan U.S.-China relation. And also at that time, people in Taiwan and also people around the world are also discussing about the upcoming U.S. election. And then we are talking about that if Trump is reelected, and he may have a different approach compared with President Biden. So the report targets at the situation of the status quo and possible development under Lai Ching-te's administration and also the upcoming U.S. administration. So didn't going further to discuss the involving status quo definition and how Taiwan, China, and the U.S. Perceive this status quo. So it is also, of course, very valuable because what in Taiwan we consider status quo is very much different from China's perception of status quo. And therefore, when I say that Lai Ching-te will very likely not to declare independence in his 4 years, and China does not think that way because they have much more expectation for staying status quo. So that kind of evolving definition will definitely emerge, and then we will need to have more discussion. And Trump administration's policies on Taiwan and China and also on status quo will play a very important role. So these are the responses to the status quo related issue. And as for Ian's comments or Ian's sharing ASEAN perspective, I think it is quite understandable that here in Taiwan, we consider to have very close relation with countries in Southeast Asia and also increasing close time with India, for example. All these countries are under Tsai Ing-wen's new southbound policy in her 2 terms, and promoting trade, investment, people-to-people ties, and also a lot of collaboration. However, these 8 years of implementation of the new southbound policy, and we do see a lot of closer relation in with regards to trade, with regards to investment, and also supply chain collaboration. But it doesn't really translate into political support from most of these countries, and therefore now President Lai Ching-te is considering how to, based on the previous achievement under the new southbound policy, to go further, not only for trade, not only for investment, not only for supply chain partnership, but also to go and create more strategic partnership without having this country feeling sensitive. So I think that will be the direction the Lai Ching-te government will continue to develop. And by the way, Southeast Asian countries have been very important. And in the past 5 years, we also have developed very close tie with India and also with Australia and also New Zealand. So yes, it is very important to diversify strategic relation with countries, not only continuing this engagement with Trump administration, but also with stakeholders, stakeholding also important countries, not only here in Asia, but also we have developed very close relation with European member states, including the West, some of the members as well as non-EU members. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Christy. So now I'm going to open up the floor, and we have received a question in the box, which I will actually address to Anne, which is from Patrick Zoll. And he asks, President Trump's engagement with Russia over Ukraine seems to indicate that he is dividing the world into spheres of influence of the great powers. One could argue that this means that Taiwan belongs to China. Is this being discussed in Taiwan's media and or among experts? And how do our Taiwanese participants see this? So Anne, I will start with you, and then if Ian or Christy would like to address that, then please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The situation of Ukraine's peace, the current peace talk that U.S. and Russia is conducting has been widely reported in Taiwan, and this will certainly draw attention and concern to the Taiwanese people and the government. One will probably know that, and many of you will probably know that there has been already concerns about U.S. commitment to Taiwan's security for a long time. So what we call this U.S. skepticism. in Taiwan. So this will probably compound that after what the approach that Trump takes to deal with the peace talk. But I don't think that at the moment, I will probably sort of agree with Frank at the moment that Trump is still sort of shaping his sort of strategy and policies towards Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific as a whole. In fact, that I suspect that the reason, I think Pete, if you remember, Pete Hudson, the DOD secretary, have said a few days ago in Brussels that Trump government would like to sort of clean up a few mess in over the other parts of the world in order to focus more on Asia Pacific and the competition with China. So in that, I think that it might be early to say that that Trump will take a completely identical approach on Taiwan as he has done at the moment to Ukraine. And I also believe that there is an opportunity for Taiwan to have to strongly lobby and strongly communicate its positions and concern to Trump and his close officials that on the foreign policy and defense circle and national security circle to send a very strong message on what Frank has said. I think, but this is a concern that Taiwan must take it seriously, and I think Taiwan Lai Ching-te government has taken steps in the right direction by announcing important conclusions on its first national security conference security meeting results conclusions just a few days ago. And the first top priority is Taiwan-US relations. So and he has announced several measures to deal with it. So I think they need to incorporate that and watch U.S. Potential change very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And I'll just hand that over to Ian as well to make some comments on the question.
Absolutely. So I do agree that it's not apparent that the Trump administration has fixed its Asia policy or its Taiwan policy at the moment. So there's still a lot of flux there. But overall, I think this sort of attitude that the Trump administration and the president himself has conveyed that, you could see major powers sort of carve up different parts of the world. There's the Taiwan-Ukraine thing, but we have to put this in context with Trump's comment on Greenland, his joke, maybe not joke about Canada, and also his sort of talk about moving Palestinians out of Gaza. So this is an approach that seems very much like a throwback to the past, where it's major powers carving up the world, and it is indeed consistent with what the PRC and the Xi Jinping has talked about. I mean, previously they said, well, the U.S. can move, to the east in the Pacific, and the PRC can be more dominant in the Western Pacific. They talked about the U.S. not being a resident power, not being a resident actor in the Western Pacific. This is also similar to President Vladimir Putin's comments about where they see Russia's sphere of influence, for lack of a better term, will be its sort of presence in Ukraine. And the reason why I'm painting this picture is because if we see a world where you see major powers try to carve up the different spheres of influence, it will, countries, actors that, aren't in that sort of major power club will fare very badly, right? So whether we're looking at the scramble for Africa back in the late 19th century, whether we're seeing colonialism in Asia, or whether we're looking at the Monroe Doctrine, the comments by these sorts of major power leaders all sort of hark back to that sort of age. And of course, even in Europe, going perhaps as recently as Yalta, there will be countries that will find themselves on the wrong side, on the side that they don't want to be, regardless of what choice they think they can make. So, in essence, that sort of attitude, if it is carried through by the Trump administration, will leave many middle and smaller actors much worse off than they currently are. So I think the question isn't just the Taiwan-Ukraine one, but one that I think many other actors really need to think about seriously, especially in terms of how they want to secure their interests in this sort of a world.
Right. Thank you, Ian. And since you mentioned Yalta there, and we have a question from the audience as well, Patrick Cronin, the second Patrick asking questions today, was asking about the if you can imagine some kind of possible fourth communique on Taiwan, and if that could be congruent with Taiwan's interests and values. And I'm keen to hear from anyone on the panel about what you think about that. And just while you think about it, I'll have a second question here, which I'll direct to Frank, which is the one from Ian Chong, who is asking, the weapons purchased by Taiwan government have not been delivered yet. Will the Trump administration improve this situation, which I interpret to mean that will these be actually delivered? And would the audit by this odd new outfit that Elon Musk is heading, the DOJ, affect that delivery? And I'd also like to extend that a little bit more, not just weapons, but how has the current chaos in DC and the restructuring of the bureaucracy that Frank mentioned before, how is that already affecting the relationship with Taiwan? So I'll first direct that question to Frank, then would like to hear from Christy a little bit about that. I'll then go back to Ian, who to just respond a little bit about the fourth communique. Thanks.
Thanks, Sewell. Yes, I will leave the excellent Yalta 2.0 question to my colleagues in the panel, but I can speak a little bit to the federal restructuring going on right now. Again, this kind of comes back to my point about as direct engagement with Trump as possible in order to get things which are stuck in the system moving as quickly as possible. We've seen this happen in the past, certainly in the first administration, but that's all the more important now. I wouldn't characterize Musk's DOJ as conducting an audit. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, does audits and is staffed with professionals, and they're very good at this. What this is an effort to, based on a belief that the federal bureaucracy has too many people working in it, and the best way to save money is to cut salaries, when that is not the case, is simply going through each federal bureaucracy and trying to cut staff based really upon the easiness, depending upon whether or not they were whether they're quote unquote probationary. Probationary meaning it can be someone who's new to the role, who's junior. It can mean that they've been promoted in the last year or so, but who have less job protections than other employees, and trying to cut those really on that basis. So right now, it is a challenge to the capacity of the different bureaucracies to conduct work because these things are going on fairly constantly in a very short notice. Longer term, it remains to be seen how much this might delay things, but it is certainly a complication for U.S. partners and at the moment. And again, the thing that can break these kinds of deadlocks is a direct presidential order to make this happen. And that's kind of what needs to happen in this context more immediately. So I will defer to my colleagues here on the question on a possible fourth communique.
Thank you, Frank. I'll just head over to Christy just to hear a little bit about how the current restructuring of the bureaucracy in DC is affecting Taiwan at this moment.
Yes, I think that is a very important and timely question for Taiwan now because in the past years, under Tsai Ing-wen's first term and also second term, her administration has developed a pretty good relation with Trump first term and also with Biden administration. A lot of happening that have put Taiwan-U.S. relation to a highest level that have never been seen, including trade, including investment, including technological cooperation, and also U.S. has passed a number of legislation that promote and allow high-ranking officials exchange between the two sides. So since just for a little background, U.S. has become Taiwan's second largest trade partner since 2022, because Taiwanese government and also Taiwanese business have de-risked their dependence on Chinese market as well as Chinese investment to explore further trade and investment relations with other countries, and mainly the U.S. And also since 2 years ago, the U.S. has become the largest FDI destination for Taiwan. That means not only major companies have set their footprints in Taiwan, but also TSMC is leading semiconductor suppliers going to the U.S. So that kind of relation have been developed under Trump's first term as well as Biden administration. So we definitely hope that kind of collaboration and very close relation and strong support from the U.S. will continue. For example, one issue that has been very difficult as far I was told by other Southeast Asian countries that Biden administration and also the Congress has supported to sign a bilateral tax agreement with Taiwan, though it is now still suspended. But we do hope that kind of collaboration, that kind of support will be continued. And also we believe that right now is a very important timing for U.S. and Taiwan to further collaborate in terms of this relocation of supply chain, and also in the sense that right now this new technology, AI, all this kind of development, Taiwan has been playing a very important part, and U.S. has the resource and U.S. have the market and also incentive to have more collaboration from Taiwan. So we do think that kind of collaboration will be continued. Hopefully Trump will understand the importance of keep engaging with Taiwan. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you. And over to Ian to respond to the question about a potential fourth communique and what that would include.
So this is something that Patrick Cronin should know well. So yeah, he probably knows this as well as I do. But I will say this about a potential fourth communique. It is possible there is talk about some sort of potential deal, right, over Taiwan. But I also want to underscore the fact that this sort of talk about deal making and transactional relations sometimes ignores or forgets the fact that you can have a deal, but then there's also the question of reneging and commitment, right? You can make a deal, one side or the other, both sides can walk away from it. And there's also a situation, as with the communique, as with the three communiques right now, where each side sort of think that they got what they wanted, but then are having a little bit of bias regret. I mean, anyone who's not read the communiques, I really recommend that you do so, especially the first communique, on which the other two are predicated on in important ways. So the U.S. position, right, was that it acknowledges the position of Chinese people on both sides of the strait as one China, et cetera, et cetera. But that is different from the Chinese position, where they see Taiwan as part of China, a China where the PRC is the sole legitimate government. So they both sort of went away thinking that they sort of got what they wanted, but not really. And if you look at the structure of the first communique, it's basically the Chinese side stated whatever, the United States side stated whatever. And it was this effort to cobble together some sort of agreement to disagree in light of the need of both the United States and the PRC to account for competition with the Soviet Union. So if we're thinking about a fourth communique, the sort of conditions, they will, at least they sort of, because they're looking at some other third actor competing with that sort of Russia element is very, very different today than it was from the early 70s to the early 80s. And I think at the same time, you also have the question of whether the two sides trust each other enough. Because the other thing with the third communique is why there was no fourth communique was that the PRC side believed that the US side would draw down arms sales to Taiwan. The US side believed that that any drawdown in arms sales would be predicated on a decrease in threat to Taiwan by the PRC. And so they sort of walked away thinking about different sorts of things. And there was a disagreement after that. And we know this with the declassification of the 6 assurances and the memo explaining the US interpretation of the 1982 communique. So could there be a fourth communique that's congruent with Taiwan's interests and values? In the broad realm of possibility, yes, but to get there in a way that both Beijing and Washington agree and can stick to, I think is extremely difficult. Sorry, long-winded answer, but I hope I got to your point.
Right. Thank you, Ian. And then I would like to direct the question from Jennifer Ladd to Anne to answer. The question is, China has significantly increased aggression against and toward Taiwan in the last year or two. What are your thoughts on what that escalating aggression and Taiwan's response to it might mean for the future of the status quo? And anyone else is also welcome to answer. I also like to just point out that we probably have more questions than we have time to answer, so please keep your answers as brief as you can. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I think it's very important. But I will think in this way. The increasing sort of aggression on Taiwan is not just military. There are a lot of what they call the gray zone operations, and there is also political influences, economic pressure, and the sort of even to try to shake up Taiwan's democratic systems on the way forward. So it's a comprehensive operation, integrated operations that combines almost all the toolboxes, everything in China's toolboxes, and there are probably more coming. So I think if we think about the 3-war approach, we have to think very carefully about the psychological warfare and the propaganda warfare, in addition to the military side of it. We have already talked about deterrence, and I think that should be continued. But in Christie's report, she also mentioned about innovative way. So I think one way is that we really have to, Taiwan need to make an effort to first to ensure correct understanding of the status quo, how it is actually different from Taiwan's perceptions vis-a-vis China's perceptions, and also to ensure that the U.S. and Taiwan coordinates on in meeting Taiwan's sort of purpose to ensure its security and negotiating from a position of strength. I also think that just to follow up on Ian's remark just now, I also think Taiwan needs to make a great effort to ensure that sympathy to our situation doesn't mean it will translate automatically into concrete actions of support. So Taiwan need to work on that. And also we need to, from the Ukraine lesson, we also need to ensure that no secret deal that Trump will pursue with China, as Nixon has done in the 1972. I'm not quite completely sure yet, but I think that there is some reminiscence. It reminds me of the 1972 when Nixon tried to sort of align with China to counter Soviet threat. But now we are seeing that perhaps U.S. is trying to compete with China, but and therefore it wants to settle other problems first. And one thing is to build up some sort of ameliorate its sort of confrontation or conflict with Russia. So is the tide changing? I think we have to watch this very carefully, but we want to ensure that there will be no secret deal between US and China. And so I think the world one of the innovative ways is to for Taiwan to work with other countries, not just the United States, to ensure that Taiwan's external security and internal stability will not break down, and our political system and social economic system will not break down. This is, I think, one of the most important tasks we have moving forward. So I hope I answered part of the question. Thank you.
Thank you. And if anyone else would be interested in responding to that question, then please go ahead. Otherwise, I would like to just synthesize two questions here that talk about kind of alternative defense cooperation for Taiwan, if there are potential partners that are not the United States. So somebody here is suggesting the OSCE's Asian Partners for Cooperation Group, for example. There's a discussion here, or a question here about whether Taiwan can establish some kind of joint defense cooperation with Japan and South Korea, including regional air and naval forces similar to the joint Nordic Air Force. I would probably preface by saying that I personally, as somebody from the Nordic countries, I don't believe that to be very likely. But I think that there's still worth in perhaps exploring what kind of defense cooperation could be possible. So we have 3 minutes, so perhaps I'll just take whoever raises their hand first. And if not, I'm going to go back to Christy, who could try to kind of put it all together. Thanks.
Okay, can I just go back a bit to the restructuring of the U.S. government? Because, right, of course, everything is still going on and not finalized yet, but we do see for example, the USA, right? And USA continuous support from USA will mean a lot to not only Taiwan, but also most countries here in Asia. And if the budget or if the organization, the institutional function will really be limited, I do think that Taiwan can play a more active role. Not by saying that Taiwan can replace the US in giving up all this donation, but in certain areas, for example, people-to-people exchange, capacity building, for example, capacity building, and also for green energy, and also for fundamental issues such as food security, etc. I think Taiwan can play a very important role because we have this kind of program with some of these countries here in this region for decades, and some of these issues have been highlighted under Tsai Ing-wen's New Southbound policy. And if in the future this USA program is going to program in this region are going to be limited or even illimited, I think Taiwan can still build a partnership with the US, or of course with other countries too, in providing that kind of program, capacity building, etc., to countries in this region. So for this, I just add to the restructuring of the US government.
Thank you, Christy. And I will just hand over the question about other defense cooperation to Ian, and then I will wrap up this webinar. Thanks.
Joint defense cooperation is going to be difficult because there's fear of provoking Beijing. That having been said, Japan and South Korea have direct interests in the stability of Taiwan and the area around it. Why? Because their exports have to go around Taiwan one way or the other. Their imports of energy, food as well, their telecommunications, the submarine cables that they connect with not just Southeast Asia, but also points west, South Asia, Europe, Africa, that all runs around Taiwan. So any disruption to Taiwan will have an immediate effect on the security and interests of Japan and South Korea. So even if they do not work jointly with Taiwan in a sort of obvious way, they do have to think about how they want to protect their own equities.
Right. Okay, thank you. I think we managed to capture quite a broad number of questions and answers in this very interesting 1 hour and 15 minutes. I will apologize to those in the audience who stuck around to hear the answers to their questions and then we were not able to get to them. But I am very grateful for the great engagement that we've had from our audience and these great questions. Thank you so much to Christy for this fantastic report that you've written. I encourage everyone to go on to apln.network and download it for free. I also would like to thank all our panelists, Anne, Ian, and Frank, for joining us and for providing their perspectives on this very crucial and timely issue. And finally, again, I would just like to express my thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who has supporting the Asia Pacific Leadership Network's Asia Dialogue on China-US relations. So with that, I will say have a good day or a good night for Frank and other colleagues who are joining us from the US. And I look forward to see you at a future webinar or perhaps even in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.